for a government bailout to keep constructing the vessels and keep doing business. Now, Parliament said we cannot afford to support two major players, but if you could agree to a merger, we could support one major enterprise. So these two big companies had no choice but to merge to survive the Great Depression. So they became the Cunard White Star Line, and as a result of that merger, construction resumed on the ship. So she was designed by Cunard, but she set sail as a Cunard White Star ship. Now, she set sail May 27th, 1936. That was her maiden voyage leaving Southampton, England, which was her home port, bound for New York. She was a North Atlantic liner, so crossing from Southampton to New York, that was her usual route or her run. And she usually crossed the Atlantic in about 4.5 days' time, which was probably a day faster than most other ships. And she was built for speed. I told you she was built to be the fastest ship afloat. Her cruising range was 25 to 32 knots. That's about 30 to 35 miles per hour. This ship is 1,019.5 feet long. Even by today's standards, that is incredibly fast. Now, the Titanic's top speed, does anyone know what that is? Their rated top speed was 21 knots. They were pushing for 23. And so 23 was well beyond the scope of their max speed. This ship's cruising range was 25 to 32. So the lowest end of her cruising range was still well above Titanic's top speed. Do you think she was bigger or smaller than Titanic?
Small.
Bigger. Now, actually, to put the two side by side, you could tell the Queen Mary was bigger, but she's not going to look immensely bigger. The way they actually determine a ship's true size is not by the overall dimensions, but what they call the gross tonnage. That is the volume of all internal decks combined. It's kind of like figuring the square footage on a house. Now, Titanic had 9 decks, and its gross tonnage was 46,300 registered gross tons. This ship had 12 decks, so 3 more decks than Titanic. Its gross tonnage was 81,237, so almost double the gross tonnage of Titanic's. Now, the big difference was because she had 3 more full-length decks. She was about 140 feet longer, 30 feet wider, 10 feet taller. However, modern cruise ships make this ship look tiny. Carnival docks 2 ships right next to us, the Radiant and the Panorama. They're both about 10 years old, kind of less than that, but right at a decade. And they're a lot bigger than this ship. In fact, Royal Caribbean has the largest ships in the world, bar none. The largest ship they have, they just launched this year, Icon of the Seas. It's set sail next year. That ship has 20 decks and is 250,800 gross tons. So think about how much more immensely big that ship is than this ship. However, as big as that ship is, it's only configured to carry 9,000 people. That's going to be important here in just a second when I talk about this ship's career during World War II. Now, the first 3 years of her career, 1936 to 1939, she's very successful as an ocean liner because she's very expensive and very exclusive. Movie stars love to travel on the ship, even members of Parliament, the royal family. Everyone loves to travel on the ship because it's such a flex to do so. But 1939 would change a lot of things for the ship. That was the beginnings of World War II. She was drafted into military service starting in 1940 to transport troops for the Allied forces. She would also serve as a hospital ship and a prisoner of war transport, but primarily transporting troops. She starts out carrying 5,000 per crossing in 1940, which was more than the 3,200 people she would carry as an ocean liner, usually 2,000 passengers, 1,200 crew. She starts out with 5,000 troops per crossing. By 1942, she is taking 15,000 troops at a time, not just crossing the Atlantic, but sailing all over the world. In fact, July of 1943, she sets a world record that she still holds today for the most souls in history ever carried aboard any single ship. 16,683 people were on this ship. Now, there's pictures up there of what that would have looked like. They look like swarms of bees out on the deck. They used every square inch of space on the ship to transport those troops. And no one has ever carried more because it's just as dangerous to overload a ship, even in 2023, as it was in 1943. But again, going back to the Royal Caribbean, think of how much more massive that ship is, and the fact that it's only configured to carry 9,000 people. This ship had almost 17,000 people on it at one time. Actually sat 4 feet lower in the water because the payload was so heavy on those voyages. Now, throughout the war, she makes 72 wartime crossings, transporting right at 900,000 troops. 1947, at the conclusion of the war, she goes back into passenger service and sails for another 20 years as an ocean liner after World War II. By 1960s, jet air travel is quickly evolving, and you could just hop on a plane and fly across the Atlantic in about 7 hours, and it was a heck of a lot cheaper than traveling on an ocean liner. In fact, an ocean liner like this was still very expensive. A round-trip voyage in first class for a single cabin, not a suite, but a single cabin, going to cost you about $22,500 in today's money. Round trip voyage in second class still going to cost anywhere from $12,500 to $15,000. And even in third class, the cheapest tickets are ranged from $7,500 to $10,000. So even in third class, you had money to travel on the ship. By the 1960s, though, they were not turning a profit anymore because the ship was so expensive to operate. She was not fuel efficient because she was so fast. She got 13 feet to the gallon. In fact, fuel was her biggest operating expense. It was costing in fuel alone to get her across the Atlantic one way, in today's money, over $635,000. And she was sailing about half full by the 1960s. So 1967 is when she's retired from service and sold to the city of Long Beach for $3.45 million. She would arrive here December 9th under her own power, December 9th, 1967. She's been here ever since. So the big takeaway from the history portion is that this ship had a 31-year career sailing out at sea, both as an ocean liner and serving during World War II. But believe it or not, this December marks 56 years since her arrival here in Long Beach. I don't think people realize just how long the ship has been here, but it's now a far longer fixture in our history of Southern California, more so than she ever was sailing out at sea. Any questions about anything related to her history or service? That's her whistle. Any of you been underneath that thing when it blasts? Oh my gosh. So you can hear that thing for 10 miles and you can feel the reverberations for up to 100 miles. And it will stop your heart if you're standing directly below it. What's that noise? So we're going to kick things off here, talking about the ship's engineering. And here you can see the layout. This is helpful for us because when the ship arrived in 1967, a lot of changes were made to the ship. They converted the ship over into the purpose it now serves. And one of the things they did, they cut up and removed all the boilers and the forward of the two engine rooms. So this is all gone and gutted down here now. But we can see on the cutaway how everything was arranged. Now we know we have some Titanic fans here. They were both similar in that they were steam-powered ships. What does that mean? Well, most of us know the way these ships move in the water, they have propellers, or screws is the technical term for them, down below the water line here. These spin, throwing water away from the ship. As they do so, that creates this centrifugal force that propels the ship forward in the water. Now, the ship is steered by a centrally located rudder. So there were 4 propellers, 2 on either side of the ship. Between the 2 sets of propellers was that centrally located rudder, or fin. And that turns from side to side to guide the ship in one direction or the other. This was the largest rudder ever installed on a ship up until this time. 3 stories tall, 140 tons, electronically and hydraulically driven. But these were all powered by steam. The steam came from these giant furnaces called boilers in the lower portions of the ship. So essentially they are just that. They're big furnaces that have tubes running alongside them. The tubes have water inside of them. That water becomes superheated and boils off to create steam. Now, the reason you have smokestacks on a ship, we all know fire makes smoke. They don't want the smoke. So the smoke from the fire is what's discharged through the smokestacks. The steam stays within the ship and is sent to drive those engines and systems down here. Now, before we talk about the way the boilers work, we're going to talk about this room right here. That's the water treatment plant. So they would pull in seawater and extract, remove the extra salt, the impurities, the minerals, make purified water for passenger drinking and passenger use. That is not where they get the water for the boilers, however. The water for the boilers was distilled water, the purest water anywhere aboard the ship. They couldn't make that. They couldn't make it from scratch, I should say. So they would bring it on in port and store it within the sections of the hull. If you look at this cutaway, you see all the segments along the bottom. There were 2 holes, one built inside the other, and they would use the channel, the space in between, to actually store that distilled water for the boilers. That is also where they stored the water, or the fuel for the fires that they would burn in the boilers. Now, the reason they used distilled water for the boilers is because these systems were all built into the ship. They were closed systems. They had to be able to last for the lifetime of the ship. Let's say you used filtered water, even bottled water that we drink from the store. Once that water turns from a liquid into a vapor, there are particulates and minerals left behind. They could corrode and gunk up the insides of these closed systems, but distilled water does not pose that threat. So they used distilled water exclusively in the boilers, and the fuel was also stored in that section as well. The reason they stored both of those in the hull is because they didn't have to take up valuable deck space with big tanks for the water and the fuel, but also they can manipulate where that was located within the sections of the hull to help stabilize the ship as the voyage went on, to keep a low center of gravity. Same thing applies on planes now. When you fly, the majority of the fuel sits under the wings and the belly of the plane, the aircraft. Now, the boilers down here, she had 27 boilers, and there were 2 different types. Actually, before I talk about the boilers, I should talk about the fuel source they used. What type of fuel source do you think they used for the boilers on here, the fires? Most people would think coal, right? Yeah, Titanic was a coal-powered ship. This ship didn't use coal. A lot of ships were still using coal at the time, but coal was dirty, it was not very efficient, it was expensive, and you had to pay stokers around the clock to shovel coal into the fires to keep them lit. So they decided to find an alternative fuel source. They settled on bunker C fuel oil, which is similar to diesel in that it's a byproduct of refining higher grades of fuel, but unlike diesel, which tends to be a liquid, this is a semi-solid resin. It was not very user-friendly to work with, and it actually had to be steam heated to 150 degrees just so it would flow into these gravity-fed boilers. Even then it flowed like molasses. It was very thick and viscous. But being gravity-fed systems, you would have trimmers down here to maintain the fires, but you didn't have to have a team of stokers keeping these fires lit 24/7. But as you know, by the 1960s, that was a very expensive fuel source, so it was not economical by the 1960s. However, in the 1930s, since no one was really using it, that's why it was chosen, because they could buy it for pennies on the barrel back then. But back to the boilers here. There were 27 boilers, 2 different types. Boiler room number 1 had 3 Scotch-type boilers. So the Scotch-type boilers were long cylindrical boilers, 17 feet in diameter. They would heat up steam to 225 degrees Fahrenheit, condense that to 225 pounds of pressure per square inch, and that was the steam exclusively used to power the 7 turbo generators. Between this room here and this room here, they would generate all of the electricity for the ship. All the systems, the electricity for the lights in the passenger cabins, all came from those 7 turbo generators. In all, they could produce 9,100 kilowatts, or 9.1 megawatts of electricity, enough to power a city of 100,000 people. So quite the power plant on board. Now, boiler rooms 2 through 5, you had 24 boilers between these boiler rooms, and they were all the same type. They were called Yarrow tube boilers. They were big 25-foot square boilers that would heat up steam to 700 degrees Fahrenheit, condense that to 400 pounds of pressure per square inch, and that was the steam exclusively used to power the engines back here in the engine rooms. So you had 2 engine rooms, the forward and the aft, or engine room 1, engine room 2. We're going into the aft, engine room number 2, because the forward is gone now. But quick brain check. How many propellers were there? 4, exactly right. So each of the engine rooms controlled 2 of the propellers. The 2 outboard or outermost propellers were controlled from the forward engine room, that's gone now. The aft engine room, where we're going, controlled the 2 inboard or innermost propellers. Now each one of these propellers could be independently driven. That was kind of a unique feature because, excuse me, as big as this ship was, you know it wasn't incredibly nimble. It would take a half mile to turn 180 degrees, so she relied on tugboats to get her in and out of port. However, since each one of these propellers could be independently driven, they could turn them in different directions, they would use that from time to time so she could make her way in and out of port under her own power in the events of like tugboat strikes. There were tugboat strikes during her career in New York, so that was a feature they would have to use from time to time. These days, ships don't rely on a rudder at all. In fact, this is what you call a fixed propulsion system. Those propellers spin, but the shafts they're mounted on, they just spin within the housing that's attached to the ship. They can't move. These days, ships, if you happen to watch one of the Carnival ships docked next to us, they actually take off sideways from the port because the propellers are actually mounted on what they call a propulsion pod. It's a pod that swivels almost 360 degrees. They can direct that thrust in whatever position they want, so that eliminates the need for a rudder. And they can actually steer them much more efficiently. Nothing like that could be done with this ship. But the engines were very powerful. These were turbine engines. Now I'm not going to go too in depth while we're up here. I'll wait till we get in the engine rooms to talk about how they function. But turbine engines were not new technology, but it was kind of revolutionary for a ship of the time to exclusively use turbines for their engines. Most ships at the time were primarily big reciprocating engines, big piston engines that were about 3.5 stories tall, just essentially big cranks that would crank the propeller shaft. They were not very complex, and they were tried and tested over the years, so very little went wrong with them. They were certainly powerful. Titanic had 3 propellers, 46,000 horsepower between them. This ship had 4 propellers, and each one of the engines was capable of 40,000 horsepower. So much more powerful, 160,000 horsepower in total, but they could push that to 200,000 horsepower. I will say the big trade-off was with using these turbine engines, they were much smaller and more powerful, but they produced constant vibration. That's why a lot of shipping lines weren't choosing to use them at the time, because those big reciprocating engines would mimic the rocking of the waves against the ship, whereas these produced a constant vibration, so if your cabin was situated above these engine rooms, you could feel everything for the entire voyage. But this is where second class was. They paid a little bit less, but they had to deal with that for the whole voyage. Now, before we go to the engine rooms, this is kind of a top-down view of how everything works. Any questions about any of the systems or anything before we make our way down? All right, let's head on down to the engine rooms. Everyone should be out of here, so if we see anything, it's probably a ghost. As we're making our way down, you will see pictures of celebrities. Anytime you do see a photograph of a celebrity here at the ship, that was photographed when they were sailing aboard this actual ship. So here we have Alfred Hitchcock, Cary Grant, Elizabeth Taylor, Mae West, Lou Costello, Walt Disney, Jimmy Stewart, Charlton Heston, Audrey Hepburn. We also know that Bob Hope, the Three Stooges, John Wayne, Judy Garland, Fred Astaire, Liberace, Ella Fitzgerald, JFK, Bessie Arnaz, Sir Winston Churchill, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, you name it. They were big time. They would have sailed all the ships. Now, as we're making our way down, you will come face to face with one of the ship's original anchors. Each one of the anchors was 18 feet tall, weighed 16 tons, had 990 feet of chain attached, and each one of those links was 224 pounds. And yes, I did voice that all by just after I finished drawing that illustration over there.
You're a Renaissance man.
You know what? I do what I can. They don't pay me enough, right? By the way, have any of you heard of the Blue Riband? Does anyone know what the Blue Riband is? Or the Blue Ribbon, some people call it the Blue Ribbon. That was a speed award given to any transatlantic liner that made a record-breaking crossing of the North Atlantic. Before the days of jet air travel, these ships would compete for that speed award, and if you crossed the Atlantic from Cherbourg, France to New York, or New York to Cherbourg in record time, you held the Blue Riband until someone came and broke your record and took it away from you. Well, the Queen Mary held the Blue Riband twice in her career. Usually when a ship won the Blue Riband, it would hold it for a year, maybe two, before another ship broke their record. The second time the Queen Mary won it was in 1938, when she crossed the Atlantic in 3 days, 20 hours, and 42 minutes. That was such a solid win because it usually took her 4.5 days to cross it, which was faster than other ships at the time. She held the Blue Riband for 14 years. Wow. Now the ship that took it from her was the SS United States, which was designed to capture this Blue Riband on its maiden voyage, and it did so. It still holds it today. Now, no one competes for the Blue Riband anymore, so they will probably hold it for the rest of time, but kudos to them, they got what they wanted. And as a matter of fact, this ship is interesting to talk about because the only reason this ship exists is because of the tremendous success of the Queen Mary and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, during World War II. Both ships were serving as troop transports for the Allied forces, but they belonged to Great Britain. Now, they were called the secret weapon of Winston Churchill because they were able to move so many thousands of troops. And whenever the war had concluded, the US government realized that we don't have anything like that at our disposal if there's a World War III. So it was actually the US government that underwrote a loan of $80 million to build a ship that's almost as big as the Queen Mary, but about half the weight and designed to be way faster. The Queen Mary's top speed was 32 knots, this ship's top speed was 42 knots. She could go over 20 knots in reverse, which is unheard of. Most ships can only do a drifting speed in reverse, and she could go 20 knots in reverse. But looking at her interiors over here, no qualms about saying it is the ugliest ship I've ever seen in my life. I think the outside looks kind of cool, but the interior is not so much. I will say this came about at a time between design aesthetic movements, so Art Deco was out. The mod movement of the 50s was not quite here yet, so they kind of created a hodgepodge of the two styles. Also, everything that was chosen inside was to be lightweight, not flammable, and easily stripped so they could make it into a troop transport ship in less than 8 hours. So they could convert this from an ocean liner to a troop transport in less than 8 hours. Yeah. So it was the first ship to be fully air conditioned, first passenger ship to be fully air conditioned by the Carrier Company. You all know Carrier HVAC systems. But also all the pictures you see in here, looking at all the chair legs, table legs, everything is made of aluminum, plastic, lightweight composite materials. In fact, even in the first class areas, in the dining rooms and lounges, you might see marble medallions or sculptures hanging on the walls. You couldn't get close enough to actually tell, but they were made of styrofoam, painted styrofoam. Yeah, so everything's lightweight. But the only two things made of wood on the entire ship, at least legend says the only two things, were the Steinway piano, which they actually reached out to the Steinway brothers to see if they could get an aluminum piano made, and they said, absolutely not, we're not going to do that. And the butcher's block in the kitchen. That's it. Only wood on the entire ship. Now just for your heads, all the stairs that we're taking down here, the platforms we're using, these are not original to the space. The original catwalks are still here. Most of them are covered over by these platforms now, but if you look around the room, you see the railings that don't quite match, or some of the walkways are real narrow and have this open rung tread style here. That's how the engineers would navigate around this room. There would be 5 to 7 engineers staffed in here at all times, with 2 greasers running back and forth between the 2 different engine rooms. This was the aft engine room, or engine room number 2. The forward was on the other side of that wall, and both rooms would look pretty much identical. They wouldn't look exactly identical, but all the components in here would be identical, because all 4 engines were the same. In fact, there's a duplicate of everything in here, so kind of divide this room in half right here. Everything on my right-hand side, there is a mirror image of it on the left-hand side. So if a platform is blocking something, you can't quite see it, just check for the other side of the room. You'll probably see the counterpart to it so you can get a better view of it. Now we're going to talk about the way that these engines worked. You know they were turbine engines, and if you're not familiar with what a turbine is, you've all probably seen a jet engine hanging off the wing of an airplane, right? That's a turbine. It's a big fan with a lot of blades, and it spins when it comes in contact with the force of energy. In this ship's case, it was compressed steam power. So the steam's coming through these big ducts or pipes, labeled high pressure ahead steam, that's coming all the way from the boiler rooms. One going to either side of the room, because there's 2 sets of engines in here. Inside that is 400 pounds of pressure per square inch moving along. It goes all the way the aft into the room until it comes in contact with the first in the series of turbines labeled high pressure ahead turbine. That white casing right there. So inside that white casing, just picture a bunch of those jet engine blades basically spinning very fast, 1,100 revolutions per minute inside the first series of turbines. Now, that is very fast, but that's not a lot of power. You need more torque than that to be able to drive those massive 18-foot in diameter, 32-ton propellers, especially the rate of speed which the ship would travel. So these were called a quadruple expansion system. 4 turbines made up each engine. And what would happen is each turbine would engage the turbine next to it, but each turbine in succession moves at a lower rate of speed, slowing down the process, but they get more torque and drive out of it that way. So the high pressure ahead turbine engages the one right next to it, which is the first intermediate pressure turbine. You're also going to realize each of the turbines gets longer and longer as the system moves on. So the first intermediate engages the second intermediate pressure ahead and high pressure stern turbine right here. And that engages the low pressure ahead and astern, which is right below my feet on this side. It's number 7 with the spotlight shining on it on the other side of the room. So those are the 4 different turbines in the series. Now, each one of those turbines has a pinion attached to it. Basically just a roller drum attached to the end of it, but those pinions are positioned around a big main reduction gear. The main reduction gear is 14 foot in diameter. It turns very slowly, but it turns as a result of those 4 pinions positioned around it. It's turning 172 revolutions per minute, which is the final output when the ship is actually moving at top speed. So the main reduction gear has the drive shaft attached to the propeller shaft, the long propeller shaft, attached to the propellers on the outside of the ship. So we usually round that up 172 revolutions per minute, we round it to 180. So essentially those propellers were turning about 3 times a second when everything is moving at top speed. Now that's kind of the way the turbines all work. Any questions about that? Now, there will be a lot of steam left over in the process. Once all these turbines are engaged and turning, a lot of steam left over. So they send whatever is left over into these giant condenser units to my right and to my left here, kind of the pistachio green looking things. And they're essentially just a big chest. And inside is a network of copper tubes, 13,780 tubes run through each one in a network. Jeez. They would pull in ice cold seawater. You see over there the seawater intake that has the green spotlight shining on it. Those are the valves. They would bring in that ice cold seawater, which the North Atlantic, year round, like clockwork, is 28.4 degrees, below freezing. It's salt water, so it doesn't freeze at 32 like fresh water does. But they bring it in, they build up pressure on these circulation pumps and route that through the network of tubes inside these condenser units. Now, the scalding steam instantly collects and forms condensation on that ice-cold surface. It drops down to collect in the reservoir, and it's sent back up to the boilers. The whole process just keeps repeating itself for the entire voyage. Believe it or not, they could get 90% of the distilled water back, recapturing it through these condenser units, just having to top off that last 10% with some purified water from the actual treatment plant for the ship. But these serve the twofold purpose, because inside those copper tubes, that ice-cold seawater, that salt water, becomes warmed up to about 90 degrees. So that is where they got the warm seawater, or salt water, I should say, for the swimming pools aboard the ship. And also, are any of you staying in the hotel by any chance? Okay, if you're staying in the hotel, look in your shower if you haven't already. You might see 2 sets of taps. Some rooms have them, some don't. I think it's mostly all the first class rooms that have them, but you would have freshwater taps and saltwater taps. So you had the option of taking a freshwater bath or shower, but if you wanted to, you were encouraged to take a mineral bath. They would call it a mineral bath, but you were really just bathing with warm seawater. The reason they would encourage that is because it would alleviate the burden on the water treatment plant to encourage people to use as much of that salt water as they could. In fact, they had high-end toiletries they would encourage passengers to use. In fact, they created their own bar of soap specifically for that purpose. The thing was, regular soap wouldn't lather in the seawater, the salt water, so they had to create a special bar of soap that would. So they would encourage people to use that as a mineral bath. Any questions about any of that? All right, well, moving on down here to the control panel or the starting platform. As I mentioned, there would be about 5 to 7 engineers in here with 2 greasers running back and forth between the two. And everything would kind of take care of itself. If you read a lot of the crew logs throughout the ship's career, their shifts were the same as shifts today. If you work on a ship, you work 4 hours on, and you have 8 hours off, then you're 4 hours on again. Same thing today. Because historically, working conditions were so bad, they had to do that so that it wasn't so taxing on your body. In fact, in here, it would be hot. It would be close to 100 degrees at all times, but sound would be deafening. Around 80 to 90 decibels at all times with all these machines up and running. But the worst place to work was the boiler rooms. Forward of the engine rooms, the boiler rooms are where the rooms were closed off by watertight bulkheads like they are here, but they were also airlocked and pressurized. It would force all the oxygen into the room, into the fires to burn at maximum efficiency, what they called a closed stoke-hold system. So they were constantly repressurizing the room. Your ears would be popping, you would be bloating. Ambient temperature was 115 degrees in there at all times. So hot, in fact, they couldn't wear regular rubber-soled shoes. They had to wear wooden-soled shoes in there because rubber soles melted to the floor. But, I mean, I guess your body probably would get used to it after a time. Your body can become used to horrific elements if you get long enough. Now here in this room though, 2 of the workers would be positioned here on the control panel. I'll actually hop over and do something you're not supposed to do. So one would be on that side, one would be on this side. I don't know if you can read the screens here on these telegraphs. This is the port enter, so right over here, this is the engine components for the port enter propeller. That is the starboard enter propeller on that side of the room. So, most of the days when the ship is in open waters, you are moving at top speed, there's literally nothing for you to do down here. You can read their logs about how they would kill time down here for the 4 hours they were on. Some of them would gamble, some of them would do things to get in trouble, just make up games to pass the time, you name it. Most of the time, you're not having to do anything unless the ship is going into port, leaving port, or if there's something dangerous that the ship has to speed up or slow down to avoid. But the way orders come down, they would come down through a telegraph system from the bridge. Now this is a telegraph. Most of you have probably seen one of these before if you watch movies like Titanic. You're used to seeing them anchored to a pedestal on the ground like this, but this is the same thing you see over here. This is also a telegraph. These are just mounted up at eye level. Now what these are is communication devices. They don't do anything other than relay information, and anytime you see a telegraph, it is linked to a counterpart somewhere. So if you manipulate one, on the other end you're going to see the effects of that. So basically, up on the bridge, if they want to tell me to do something down here, they will go to the counterpart to this up on the bridge, move the lever back and forth a couple times. That's going to make these alarm bells down here ring, so I know there's a change in order coming. So I watch my screen, and you can probably see this green arrow here. That's the indicator arrow. This is going to move based on the order I've been given from the bridge. I repeat the order back to the bridge in the same exact manner. I will move my lever to match the arrow, whatever it happens to be. On the bridge, their green arrow is going to move to show them I've received their order. I'm ready to start carrying that out. But all we've done is communicate that. Now I have to do it. So these are the valves you use to do just that. Right now, I am closing off the valve to give less steam power to the turbines. Spin this the opposite direction. I'm opening it up to give more steam power. This is the valve you would use primarily for moving the ship under regular operations. These 2 over here are used only for emergency situations. This is to reverse the flow of steam to actually turn the turbines in the opposite direction. Now you only want to do this in an absolute emergency situation because A, if the ship is moving 35 miles per hour full speed ahead and you reverse the engines, it's still going to take 10 miles for it to come to a stop. And B, things could become catastrophic down here. You could rip things out of their housing. You don't want to do that if you can avoid it if at all possible. So your best bet is always to anticipate any slowdowns or stops. Just cut the power to the engines, let the resistance of the water create enough drag to actually slow down the ship to a manageable speed, and you stop it from there. You also have other communication devices like telephones. You're all familiar with these, right? We don't have cords on ours anymore, but These are specially designed loudophones. We talked about how loud it was down here. These have elongated earpieces and mouthpieces so you can still be heard over the sounds of the machinery. And also, these are sound powered as a backup. They are electronic, but if all systems go down on the ship, these will still work simply by your voice. As you speak, there is a compression plate in the mouthpiece of the receiver that will press and depress, generating just enough spark that the sound still travels through the wire.
That's crazy.
Some people say these can still work. I've never had anyone take my call, so I'm guessing either I'm being ghosted or they don't work. Now this telegraph here, it is a telegraph like these, but it serves a different purpose. This communicates with the boiler rooms. Now, I told you this ship was not fuel efficient, but they were all about maximizing efficiency, as is the case on any ship even today. And what they would do is they would take readings, they would peer up, and they had periscopes, they could peer up into the smokestacks and see the color of smoke coming out of those boilers. So they could tell how efficiently they were burning based on the color. If there's too much black in the smoke, there's too much fuel, it's too fuel rich. If it's too white, there's too much oxygen being burnt off. They want thin wisps as clear as possible to know to reach maximum burning efficiency. This is just a way to communicate those readings back and forth. One other cool thing about telegraphs is sometimes telegraphs, I told you they're directly linked to a counterpart somewhere, but sometimes they're used as a mass communication throughout the ship. So maybe this one doesn't really affect me, but I can see two other departments within the ship communicating, and I can adjust what I need to without them having to tell me a thing, because I can see what they're communicating back and forth with each other. Any questions about any of this? I think you guys are all ready to tackle a ship. You guys want to work on a ship now? I don't either. All right. Some of you are staying in the hotel, right? You said.
Yes.
I forget who all staying in here. These engine rooms close at 6 o'clock every night, but they'll reopen again tomorrow at 11. So once the tour is over, even if you want to spend more time down here, just come back down tomorrow. Even if you're checking out at 11, stay on the ship and come back down here. You can check out everything.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Did you guys get one of the haunted rooms?
No, I think we got a normal one, and I don't think it's first class because we don't have the
I'm sorry.
showers. We have stayed in one where it did have like the air conditioning, the fresh air,
okay,
seawater, and that was previously, but this one's, I think, refurbished.
Now, believe it or not, this ship still uses the same forced air circulation system the ship used when it was in service as an ocean liner. So there was no air conditioning to speak of. There were 5 rooms that had air conditioning when the ship was sailing as an ocean liner, because on the North Atlantic, you didn't necessarily need it unless the room was just really big and full of people. So the first class dining room, the first class lounge, and about 3 other rooms did have air conditioning. The rest of the ship just had a forced air circulation system. And if you wanted a colder room, you would just open your porthole and let some of the cold air from the North Atlantic come in, circulate around in the system. But when the ship came here, they obviously had to install air conditioning. And so what they did was install chillers up on the upper decks to tie it into the same forced air circulation system. So what you're getting is still the same system, just with some chilled air. Now it's also efficient in a way. What they do to keep from cooling areas of the ship that they don't need to, if there is a whole section where no rooms are being used, let's say no hotel guests are staying in one area of the ship, they chill it in zones. They just won't turn on the chiller for that zone. So if you ever check into your hotel room and it's really warm and it doesn't seem to cool down, call the front desk because they may just need to have engineering turn on the chillers to that zone, and they can chill it.
Nice, good to know.
I tell you what, one other nice thing about having a small group, we move so quickly from place to place. If I have 35 and 40 people, it takes us 10 minutes just to get up here from the engine room.
A lot of lingers.
Wow.
It takes us 20 minutes to get down to the engine room.
Oh,
usually.
okay, yeah.
Now, as we're walking, you'll see we already referenced the photos of what this ship would have looked like when it was overloaded with troops. In fact, I averaged out the numbers whenever it made those 72 wartime crossings. That averages out to about 11,200 troops per crossing. So pretty much every crossing on average would have that many people. This is a picture of her namesake, Her Majesty Queen Mary, at the time of the ship's launch and christening. Doesn't she look very friendly? She's the one the ship was named after. In fact, this is a photograph of the ship during construction. Fun fact, some of you might know this being Titanic fans. Anyone heard of the Olympic, probably? Titanic's twin sister that came first. Now, shipbuilding was such a big deal at the time because air travel was not really a thing that it was a big public spectacle. When you were watching a ship be constructed, and it was a way to generate buzz and PR about the ship before it ever set sail. So anytime the ship was the first of its class to be built, like in this case, even though the ship was going to be black, they painted it white while it was being constructed, and also at the time of its launch, it would appear better in photographs since color photography did not exist. And once it was actually launched and in the water, they would paint it black. So even though they painted it twice, at an added expense, it photographed better if it was white. Same with Olympic, if you see her construction photos. Now, I mentioned the launch of the ship. She was the one to christen the ship, so she was the one to release the champagne bottle that broke on the bow, giving the ship its name. Up until that time, they never call a ship by its name because it was considered bad luck if you call a ship by its name until it's actually christened. And so up until that time, they'd always go by a code name. This was Job 534, meaning it was the 534th ship to be built in the John Brown shipyard up until that time that she was launched. That was also another reason they kept the name under tight wraps, because people would show up usually 200,000 to 300,000 at a time to watch these ships be christened. It was a big spectacle, so everyone would show up because they wanted to find out what the name was going to be. So that's a way to draw in the crowd. Now, a fun legend about how this ship got its name. Have any of you heard this story about how the Queen Mary allegedly got her name? No, okay, so I told you there was a merger between Cunard and White Star. Now historically, these two companies had different naming practices for naming their ships. White Star named ships names that end with IC, Titanic, Olympic, Britannic. Cunard chose names that end with IA, Mauritania, Lusitania, and Aquitania. So when the two companies merged, they decided to pick names that were neutral territory. So neither company favored over the other one. They decided to name the two ships after queens, and they wanted to have the Queen Elizabeth, that was the sister ship to the Queen Mary, and the Queen Victoria, not the Queen Mary, but the Queen Victoria. Now, it is a rule, if you want to name something after a member of the British family, you need the family's express permission to do so. Sir Percy Bates was the chair, the head of Cunard at the time, and he was close friends with King George V, who was the current King of England, and Queen Victoria was his late mother. Now, legend goes that Sir Percy Bates met with King George V and said, "We would like to name the ship after England's greatest queen," meaning Queen Victoria. King George V said, "Oh, wonderful, my wife will be delighted." His wife being Queen Mary, obviously not Queen Victoria. And Sir Percy Bates said, "That's exactly what we meant, because you never tell the king he's wrong." And the name stuck. Now, legend also has it, King George V knew exactly what they were going to ask, but he wanted to score brownie points with his wife and get a ship named after her. So, the legend says. As you're all coming down here, take special note of the world's largest bottle opener hanging on the wall.
Does that open the champagne?
Yeah, I usually do that for the champagne that they broke against the bow. Actually, believe it or not, you guys probably know this. Any of you drinkers, you probably know that technically champagne has to come from Champagne, France. If it's not from Champagne, France, it's sparkling wine. Now, it's also a big thing. Back in the days of these old ocean liners, especially British ocean liners, they were nationalists. Everything within the ship had to have been resourced from the UK. All the artisans that worked on the ship, the carpenters, the materials, they all had to be locally sourced. So the same thing applied whenever they would christen these ships. So the champagne was supposed to have come from London or somewhere on the mainland of the Great Britain, and they used imperial wine from Australia to actually christen the ship. Was scandalous at the time. Yeah, but anyway, that is not a bottle opener. That is the wrench they would use to turn this big black nut right here that actually affixed the propeller onto the shaft. So our last stop is actually going to be the propeller box, that box you saw attached to the ship. That is actually housing the last of the 4 propellers. 3 of them have been removed. 1 is still local. If you've ever been to the Maritime Museum in San Pedro and saw a big propeller in the ground, that is from this ship. That is the nose cone for that propeller that is actually in San Pedro. Now the other 2 went off to Europe. I have no idea where they are anymore. 1 is still attached to the ship. The reason we built the box around it, outside, all of the water is salt water full of marine life. We have it encased in fresh water to preserve it as long as possible. So, follow me. Now, today someone threw $1 down there, so if someone wants to come in and get that $1, I can safely say you earned it. But just think that massive propeller is turning about 3 times a second. They would change these propellers out every year, so that the blades were always razor sharp, and also that was a way to rebalance, to make sure the propellers were perfectly balanced. So what they would do, to change out the propellers, you have to lift the ship out of water and sit it in a dry dock. They would install these new propellers, and they would balance them to the point where you could walk up and spin that 32-ton propeller with one hand. And it would spin freely. That's when they knew they had it perfectly balanced. It took very little force to actually move it. Now this is actually the floor of the box that you're seeing down there. So the box is actually completely surrounding this and attached to the ship on all sides. And it rises and falls with the ship as it rises and falls with the tide. They do drain it once a year and clean everything out. They donate all the change to charity, usually at the Ronald McDonald House. But does anyone have any questions? Anything else you wanted to really find out about that you didn't hear about on the tour? Even if it's not pertaining to the engineering, feel free.
Sure. Maybe not.
Alright guys, well I'll lead us back up topside. I'll show you the way to get back on the ship. You guys can stay aboard, even if you're not in the hotel, you can stay aboard until 10:30 tonight. That's usually when they close the observation bar, and that we can go up and have a drink. In fact, I would suggest having a drink in the observation bar, because sunset starts around 6:30 to 7, and the the bow is actually facing the west, so you get some great views from the observation bar. You can sit inside or outside and check that out. I might be up there myself tonight after I change, so we'll see if I see you up there. But follow me this way, guys.
Sorry, I was gonna ask.
Yeah.
Are all of them painted black for a certain reason, or
What's that?
just the
Ships?
boat, the outside? Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Historically, does anyone know why these old ocean liners were painted black usually? It was mainly due to the fact that they ran on coal. So the coal bunkers were usually, they were filled from hatches down here around the hull of the ship, and it would create black smudges all over the ship. Even if the ship was not using coal as a fuel source when they would load it, I mean, that's when it would get dirty. But even if it wasn't burning coal, usually the smoke discharged from the funnels was black. And some of it would settle around the hull and actually just blacken it and make it dark over time. So they would just paint the hull black just to camouflage that. The red is usually a rust oxide paint, so it helps rust keep from forming around the waterline. And then at the top of the ship, usually they would paint the superstructure top half white, because it looked better against the horizon. So that was the 3-tone scheme they used on these old ocean liners for 100 years. And usually the way that, usually a way a line would show their I don't want to say their true colors, but usually all ocean liners, no matter whether they were a British ship, a German ship, Italian, they would all have that same color scheme, the white superstructure, the black hull, and then the red below the waterline, but usually they would show their company colors on the funnels of the ship. So White Star had the White Star buff. It's kind of this brown-orange color. They would paint their funnels with the black tops. And the reason they painted the tops black were because the smoke was so black it would dinge the tops. Cunard chose Cunard Red, which was like a rusty red. And now the funnels are bright red. That's not actually the color they would have been when the ship was sailing, but now most ships are white.
Yeah, I was about to say, now they're just like all white.
But
right?
they burn a lot cleaner. I mean,
Yeah, they don't have to worry about the camouflage situation, yeah. A little boring though.
yeah,
Could
true.
spice
I
it
mean,
up.
they're looking weird now. I saw the icon of the seas I was talking about. They have like this big, you know that big dome everybody's posting about in Vegas that projects things onto it?
Yeah.
The front of the ship has something like that on the icon of the seas, and I can't quite figure out what it is.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it looks really odd.
Is the 4D theaters up and running at all?
It has not reopened yet.
Okay.
I hope soon, because every day that I'm down here, people ask me about it.
Yeah.
And I would rather say, oh yeah,
Yeah,
movies
of
are gonna
course.
start showing next tomorrow.
Yeah.
But
Last time we
tired of
came.
the same old, no, not yet.
Yeah, we didn't get a chance last time we came, so maybe next
Was it
time.
playing the SpongeBob movie when you were
I
here last
think
time?
it was, yeah.
Was it?
I believe so.
SpongeBob, and then around Christmas, the Polar Express.
It was SpongeBob, yeah. It was, yeah.
Now, believe it or not, all of these red phone booths that you see, they actually came on the ship when it made its last crossing here in 1967. So they brought all these phone booths from London. There's scales that you can weigh yourself up on the upper decks. They also came aboard for that last voyage. And they brought 2 double-decker buses from London as well. One of them still operates. It still makes its way around Long Beach, and it's a mobile bar, so you can sit
Oh,
on the
that's
bus
cool.
and drink.
The old
Yeah.
booze cruise.
Yeah, booze cruise, exactly right.
Yeah.
Why did you look at me when you said that?
I didn't want to say anything, but glad you caught that. Now, if you guys want to go back up the ship since these gates are closed, you'll just go back to the main entrance, but just tell them you just came off the steam and still tour. They'll let you go right back up the elevator. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.